Great. Well, why don't we get started? We have a lot to unpack today. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. If this is your first webinar with MRG and Vantage, we're glad you're here. If you're returning, welcome back to part 2 of our webinar series focused on next level leadership, building stronger leaders and teams. Today, we're unpacking perception gaps, the small disconnects between how leaders see themselves and how others experience them. We'll cover what the research shows and offer practical real-world guidance for closing your gaps today. I'm here with our presenters, Maria Brown and Keith Goudy. Maria is the head of research and education at MRG Assessments and one of their executive coaches. She holds a Ph.D. in psychology and has conducted award-winning research on educational practices. Maria has a deep passion for understanding human behavior, and her research spans leadership and motivation, including perception gaps, which she'll share with you today. Keith is a founding partner at Vantage Leadership Consulting and one of the firm's executive coaches. He holds a Ph.D. in industrial organizational psychology and has spent decades helping organizations select and develop exceptional leaders. Keith brings real-world coaching experience to help leaders strengthen self-awareness and close perception gaps, which he will share with you today. I'll turn it over to you, Keith.
Great. Well, I'll say a little bit about Vantage Leadership Consulting. We are celebrating our 50th anniversary as a firm, which feels remarkable to us because that seems like a pretty great achievement. And we are passionate about working with leaders and helping them and the people they serve achieve their potential. And we are in the business of helping organizations and leaders evaluate readiness to take on bigger responsibility and then working with leaders to accelerate, develop, whether that's individuals working with teams, whether it's programs or part of succession planning. We have senior advisory services, board advisory services. So it's all really just in this space about building awareness or self-awareness and then figuring out what to do with it. That's us.
Okay, well, I will tell you a little bit about MRG Assessments. So we are an assessment company based in Portland, Maine, and we have really well-designed assessments that measure things like motivation, leadership behavior, leadership impact, sales performance, and more. But our assessments get to the heart of the individual and are really designed to increase self-awareness. And they help leaders have the really good conversations with their coaches about what they need to do so that they can identify those prime areas for growth and for impact. Now, we have been around for more than 40 years, and Vantage has been a partner for most of that time. We've been working together for a very long time, and it truly is a partnership, and this is one example of how we do that. We're really excited to be presenting some research based on the assessment data, but then add these real world insights about what this truly means in a coaching context. So excited to be here with you guys. So what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to go through the agenda. It's pretty straightforward. I will start by talking about the business case for self-awareness, right? Kind of why are we here? Why is it so important? I will share 6 new findings on leadership perception gaps, and I think they're pretty interesting. I hope you guys are excited to learn what those are. Then I will turn it over to Keith, who's going to talk about coaching to close those awareness gaps, how to address them through coaching. And he will share some specific examples, some case studies of how these have been approached in coaching with Vantage, with Keith and other coaches. So let's get started. But first, we're going to hear from you guys. So a poll is going to pop up, but feel free to use the QR code on the screen and let us know if you believe you have perception gaps, right? Do you believe there's a gap between how you intend to come across and how others experience you? And then let us know how actively you are working on understanding your impact on others. And we'll give you guys little bit of time to answer that. Keith and I cannot vote. We
Yeah, I
just
just
get
tried to.
they don't want to know our opinion. We want to know what everyone here is thinking.
That's right.
Let's see. So Melissa will share with us the results when they're ready. Okay. Interesting. So in the first question, right, do you believe there's a gap between how you intend to come across and how others experiencing? Some people have confirmed it a lot, right? So 47% and the same amount suspect there is a gap. So potential there for measuring those and finding out what they actually are. And then, the second question, how actively are you working on understanding your impact on others? The most popular answer is I am trying to be more aware. So you guys are in the right place, right? We're going to be talking about this, and it looks like there's a lot of energy, for the most part, to learn about these. And those of you who may not find this to be a strong focus right now, maybe we'll convince you by the end of today that that might be something to think about. Okay, so let's jump right in. So why are we here? Why should we be caring about self-awareness? So when looking at why leaders fail, here's an example of a study looking at CEOs. Where the bottom line is not what's important. It's or at least not as important as you might think. It turns out that behaviors and skills around leadership are the most important factors for keeping your leadership job. Okay. So things like taking action rather than talking too much, managing change, managing customers properly. So a lot of leadership behaviors is what's really leading to people failing at their leadership jobs. And so one way that this is addressed is through leadership training programs, right? And organizations spend a lot of money on leadership training. And that's not even considering the amount of time that leaders themselves are spending on, going through these programs, integrating the learning, shifting the way that they're doing things. So a lot of time and effort is going into this. However, most of these programs are projected to be scrap learning, okay, where the learning is delivered, but it's not applied. So essentially, once the training is done, the box is checked off, but then lasting change is rare, right? Things might last a little while, but there's no lasting change. So how do we improve that? So one thing that we really want you to consider is meeting leaders where they are in order to ensure developmental success. And Harvard actually conducted a study recently of L&D professionals and functional heads at Fortune 500 companies, where they found that out of 5 factors around success of leadership programs, the one that was top 3 or within the top 3 for most people was compatibility of the program with existing knowledge and skill sets of employees. So the message here is self-awareness is important. You need to know where someone is. You need to, figure out what their baseline is in order to determine what it is that's going to be stickier for that person or what needs to be addressed so that development actually sticks and all those resources and time are invested successfully. So next, I am going to share with you some recent findings on perception gaps and how understanding them is essential for self-awareness, right? So it's essential for leaders to understand how they're being perceived and how their leadership is being experienced by others. That knowledge is going to build the self-awareness that can lead to targeted development that meets the leader where they actually are. So let's get to that study. The first thing I will share with you is what's a perception gap, right? And I think, and Melissa introduced us to the concept, but just so I'm sure we're all on the same page. what we're looking at here essentially is we're looking for behaviors where the leader's perception of themselves and what they are doing does not align with how their colleagues are perceiving them or how their colleagues are experiencing them. Okay, so it's really that mismatch, that misalignment in perceptions of behavior. So how do we measure it in this type of study, right? We go to our database. Essentially, we're going to use data from a 360 behavior assessment where we defined a perception gap as a difference of 30 or more points between a self-perception score of a behavior and that of their average observer score. Okay. This is on a 99-point scale, so 30 points is almost a third of the scale away from the leader's self-perception. So we're looking at a pretty big gap here, right? We wanted to make sure that when we looked at perception gaps, we were truly looking at things where people had a very different idea of how this leader is behaving compared to their own self-perception. We use the LEA 360, the Leadership Effectiveness Analysis 360, and this is an assessment that measures 22 behaviors from 4 different perspectives. So there's a self perspective, the leader themselves, and then 3 different observer groups, so boss, peers, and direct reports for that leader. So you can see how this comparison works out. Here are sample questions from the self-assessment and the observer questionnaire. So in the self questionnaire, you might get a question like, when I have set an objective, I make it happen, follow it up, explain it thoroughly. So it's really about how I feel that I am behaving in this particular context. In the observer questionnaire, it's the same question, but the framing, of course, is different. So when this person sets an objective, they make it happen, follow it up, or explain it thoroughly. And people get to decide which one is most like the person being described and which one is next like them. Now, without getting into the details of the questionnaire design, which is not that important for us understanding the research, what I want to show you here is that we are looking at where people see themselves and where their colleagues see them, and how different those are by using really the same 22 behaviors and measuring them in very similar ways. Okay, so how do we run the did we run the calculation? So you've got observers, you have those 3 groups. We just calculated the average score, median score for those observers, and then we compared that average score to the self score, and that is a perception gap there. Now, it was considered a perception gap. Some people call them blind spots as well. We prefer perception gap if it's 30 points or more different from the self score. This is a study of almost 40,000 leaders. So it's a really large global sample of leaders. It covers all industries. You can see different work arrangements, and all the other demographic consideration factors are listed here. But let's get to the fun part, right? What are the findings about perception gaps? So number 1, perception gaps are common. Okay. What we found is that leaders have an average of 7.6 perception gaps out of 22 leadership behaviors. That's more than a third, right? So perception gaps are common. Perception gaps are normal. They are to be expected, and there's no need to worry, right? But it's a great opportunity once you know what they are to identify where you might want to spend some of that developmental energy that you might have. But I really like the point I really want to to convey here. Well, there are 2. 1, this is a thing. It's real. We have to deal with it. But it's okay. You're going to have them. If you go through a 360 assessment, you're going to find perception gaps, and that is absolutely normal and expected. Now, there are 3 behaviors where leaders are likely to overestimate how much emphasis they're placing on them. And those are self. So perceiving themselves as kind of being more self-directed, independent, making their own decisions, uh, being more tactical, involved in the day-to-day and, shifting gears quickly to get things done quickly. And finally, delegation. So leaders see themselves as delegating more than others are experiencing from them. Bottom line, more likely to overestimate how often they make decisions independently, seize opportunities, and adapt, and how often they delegate to others. Okay, one thing I will say before I keep going, you will get a copy of the slide deck, so don't worry about writing these down. You will get this, you will be able to look at it take your time reading through those. Okay, there are two behaviors where leaders are likely to underestimate their emphasis or how frequently they're engaging in them. And these are communicating clearly and keeping people informed, and holding people accountable, making sure that people are delivering on promises. So just two behaviors that tend to be underestimated, right? Leaders feel they're doing less of this than they actually are, according to those who are rating them on these behaviors. Finally, there are 5 behaviors that seem to show greater alignment between self and observer. And these are how persuasive someone is, so how much time someone spends trying to sell ideas and getting others to agree with their perspective or point of view, how social and outgoing someone is when they're engaging with their colleagues, how much energy and excitement someone brings into interactions with others, how much emotional restraint they tend to show, and how much emphasis they place on connection, right? Connecting with others more personally, showing empathy and concern for their well-being. What's really interesting about these 5 behaviors is that these all involve like really explicitly interpersonal relationships and interactions, right? So there's a lot more alignment in those behaviors that are more dyadic, right? Where you need to have at least 2 people involved. And so perhaps because it has to be experienced collectively, there might be more alignment in how much time people are spending on those. Perception gaps are relatively universal. So we split the sample in a lot of different ways, different regions, different industries, gender, generation, all things. And what we found is that 7.6 was very close across the board, right? So about a third of those 22 behaviors are going to be perception gaps for the average leader, regardless of their management level, where they are in the world, their gender, all these different things. So again, they're common, to be expected, and everyone apparently has to some extent. The last thing I am going to say about these findings is that perception gaps are not inherently bad or good. Right. So just because you have a perception gap doesn't mean that that's a negative. So think, for example, of the leader who underestimates how strategic they are, how much time they're spending thinking broadly, thinking about the future. That's usually a pretty desired leadership behavior. So if you're underestimating that as a leader and you find out that you're seen as more strategic than you thought, then that might actually be a little gift in your profile, right? Something that you learn about yourself that, may indicate that you're doing something right. However, underestimating how much you're delegating, especially if that feedback is coming from direct reports or peers, people who would expect you to delegate certain things to them, that might be an area for growth and for discussion. So not inherently good or bad. And that is where that conversation with your coach is going to be essential, right? Here's the debrief. Here's what the data are showing us. What does it mean? And what do I do with it? And luckily, we have Keith here who's going to take us through that thinking process, right? And how, and talk a little bit more about what you do with perception gaps now that we've learned all of this about them. But before we get to Keith, let's see if there are any questions. And Melissa will let us know.
Yeah, we do have a question. Do perception gaps reflect differences in what leaders and their observers value?
Ooh, that's a good question. Thank you, Melissa. So the way I look at it, right? So what we perceive is always filtered it's in the eye of the beholder, right? And so our values um, may bias us in one way or another. And so let's say we're someone who values connection and empathy, right? So our bar for empathy might be really high, and we might rate a leader lower than others might on that behavior just because it's something that we'd like to or we expect to see more of. So, one advantage of a 360 assessment is that you're getting feedback from a lot of different people. And so, in that way, you're able to sort of triangulate and get to what the general, perception of that person's behavior is. So, absolutely, values are going to influence it. But by involving a lot of people in that feedback process, you get a true sense. And last thing I'll say, because I could talk about this for a long time, it does matter, right? Values of the people who are perceiving and experiencing us, right? If we're being perceived in a way that is not helpful to our leadership, then it's worth a conversation about how we address it, regardless of where that perception, what might be leading to that perception. So thank you,
Maria,
Melissa, for the question.
we have one more question.
Okay.
Is self-awareness the first step for a perception gap to be addressed?
I would say yes, or it's a very early step, but I think I'd be stepping into Keith's role here today. So maybe this is a nice segue to you, Keith. What would you say about that?
Self-awareness is probably the first step into understanding or taking action on perception gaps. And I think there's a good bit of research that that's not enough. It's sort of like, what do you do with that self-awareness? For example, we might be internally self-aware, but are we externally self-aware? Do we understand how people see us? So it's really, I think, continuing to be introspective, self-aware internally, but then to think about, well, what's the impact on others? Um, Maria, I think you've handed the baton to me. And since we're talking about perception gaps, I feel like I should explain one of my own, and I think it answers the question a bit. Um, this is my almost 30th year at Vantage. And for the last 10 plus years, I've been managing partner, and I just kind of stepped back from that to focus more on consulting with Vantage now. But at the beginning of that journey, I got some 360 feedback. And, most of my adult life has been in the space of giving people feedback, evaluating readiness of leaders. And I thought I had a pretty good sense of being self-aware. In fact, I think I probably said to my colleagues, I think I know what my limitations are. I got my 360 feedback from my coach, and 5 people in our firm had commented, Keith does not put people at ease. And I've never been so accurately insulted in all of my life. It really stopped me in my tracks. And it kind of made me laugh. As a recovering introvert, I had to think, it's never once occurred to me to, Maria, put you at ease. Now, I want to be liked and I want you to like me, Maria. So I'm focused on that. And I want clients to have a good experience. Um, but I guess I would say that the first sort of step is increased self-awareness to the question we just received. And, for everyone out there, I would say, stay curious. Stay curious as to what you know about yourself, you think you know about yourself, and what others are, might be observing that you're unaware of. Because if you're not aware of how you're perceived or how you're perceived in the moment, like kind of catching yourself in the moment, then that's when you tend to have that's when you may not be, being your best self. Luckily, that perception gap for myself is pretty easy to address. Some are very hard to address. So putting people at ease. There's Maria. There's Melissa. Maybe I should put them at ease. Simply thinking about that helped me be better at it because it kind of catches me being in, task focus or something like that. So I think self-awareness and building it, and then really understanding how does it extend to how others perceive us, and then what are we going to do about it is a really big deal. Um, and in thinking about self perception gaps, I spent, as Melissa mentioned, I spent a lot of time as an executive coach, and I find a great deal of the conversation in coaching is focused on helping people understand if there are perception gaps and what the stakes are. Um, Not all perception gaps are created equal. So for some people, the stakes might be it limits their followership. If you're newly enrolled and you have trouble establishing followership, that's a really big deal. It could impact your ability to advance. It could impact your ability to be successful in your jobs. And a lot of times the coaching really just is like, hey, what are the perception gaps? Do you fully understand their implications? And as you were saying, I think, Maria, sometimes they're really positive. For example, you're really known as an empathetic leader, and you have permission to be more demanding of people. And a lot of times that's a great perception gap to have, to realize that you can hold people more accountable. We talked before about, or I mentioned that not all perception gaps are created equal. I suppose there are, nice to know perception gaps. Keith, you don't put people at ease all the time, or maybe you're not making eye contact. And then there are perception gaps that could lead to failure, or I think you used this term previously, Maria, catastrophic failures, right? Maybe a leader is publicly promoting extreme political views, and they don't understand the impact that has on their reputation or their organization. You might have an oblivious leader who surrounds, sometimes we build systems to reinforce our self concept. Leaders do this, and you may not be hearing the straight dope. You might be hearing what you want to hear from your colleagues. And think about some of the catastrophic failures you've seen when people are in public roles. Viral videos, awkward announcements in the Wall Street Journal about someone moving on. So, not all perception gaps are created equal. Look at this slide. And if you were here, I would ask how many of you agree with what you see here? But the research shows that we really aren't as self-aware as we might think we are. And so there's really an importance to continue to build internal self-awareness, external self-awareness, and to be able to catch yourself in the act. And sometimes people think that if they have a lot of experience, they've been in their role a long time, or they've been at this for a long time, they have a lot of self-awareness. Sometimes experienced leaders, according to some research published in Harvard Business Review from 2018, what self-awareness really is, sometimes experienced leaders are at a disadvantage around having self-awareness because candid feedback for them is often rare. And then it's also important that introspection is not the same as self-awareness. There's one recommendation from this article that maybe it's better to ask what rather than. So if you ask, why wasn't I able to meet my goals, that might not be as helpful as asking, what could I be doing going forward? So really just reinforcing what you said, Maria, that self-awareness often leads to more effectiveness. So perception gaps are more than one moment. Sometimes we can get caught up in the moment and think that that's what it's about, but it's really about a series of events over time. And one of the things that's really important to do is to consider the source. So when you think about the source, you will have different perception gaps from different kinds of folks in your world. Maria, you were talking about what do people overestimate. One of my observations from doing this for a while is that people often overestimate their strategic insight. And if you think about it, it's a little funny, like who wants to say, I'm just not that strategic. I think people can underestimate what does it take to succeed with the board. What is the importance of developing an external network of advisors that I can tap into? And a classic one, Maria, you mentioned this, is delegation. Probably the best source of insight on delegation is probably from your direct reports versus someone that you report into. So what should you do with perception gaps? Well, you don't want to boil the ocean. So we've said a couple of times, it's really important to contextualize what might these mean? What do you understand about them? And what do you not yet understand about them? And then really what you should do is think about what's at stake, and to think about how does this tie into what you need from your work, what does your employer need from you, and what are some of your goals. For some folks, getting airtime with the board is not that important because it does not meet with their career goals. So it's really important to think about what is my priority, what am I going to most focus on. This slide could be the most important slide in my part of the presentation. And how you respond to feedback that you get, or how you respond to becoming aware of perception gaps, is terribly important. Terribly important. And think about the people in your world, where you have to tell them something 5 times versus you only have to tell them once and they get it and they say thank you. Think about the difference in the way that you want to engage with those people. There's a great article from probably pretty long ago by Chris Argyris called Teaching Smart People to Learn. And to summarize quickly, it's hard to teach smart people to learn when they're being defensive. There's an article called The Four Horsemen of Communication, and that article talks about defensiveness. Defensiveness is related to divorce, for example. So it's really important in relationships. It's really important in work with teams. And it's so easy for leaders to miss, for people to miss that how they're responding to what they're hearing really impacts how people see them and their willingness to give you feedback in the future. It reminds me of a classic book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, and understanding that as you take on more responsibility, making it easy for people to give you feedback really becomes a big part of your success. Now, the difficult reality is it can be awfully hard to change people's perceptions of us. Sometimes it's easier than others, but when there are old tapes that get played about us, I think our experience is that one time that you slip up can erase 10 successes in changing a behavior. That's more anecdotal. You might all have your own ratios in your mind, but it's very easy to have people start playing old tapes about us. And in my experience, it's one of the things that's most frustrating for people when trying to deal with perception gaps. Certainly showing that you're committed to addressing things, being transparent about your perception gaps is really important. How you respond to feedback that you get really matters. We'll talk about that more later. And one of the things I would advise people to think about when if they're trying to kind of overcome people's tendency to play old tapes on them, there's a terrific article on trust that we often look at, and it kind of mentions that there are 4 ways in which people evaluate us in terms of, do they trust us? Do they trust that we have good judgment and are competent? Do they trust that we are authentic and we are who we think we are our actions consistent? And also, do they trust that we really care about them? And so it can be really helpful, as this article talks about, to think about your trust wobbles. Frey and Morris wrote about this in 2020. What what is your basis for trust? Is it judgment? Is it being authentic? And what is your trust level? Maybe it's being authentic, or maybe it's just not acting as if you care. We've run across a number of leaders who care deeply about the success of an organization, but sometimes people don't know if they really care about them individually. So I think that's a great way to think about addressing people's tendency to play old tapes. Um, and then it's really helpful to have trusted advisors, mentors, peers who will give you, will tell it like it is. Neuroscience research shows us that there's a lot of benefit we gain from having many sources of objectivity beyond ourselves. That's just kind of makes sense, right? It's hard to be objective with ourselves. So having a coach, a mentor, maybe a peer monitor, someone who sits in meetings with you and can give you real-time feedback is awfully important. When I think of places to start, I love the idea of just thinking about what one thing, if I improved upon, would make a big difference, or what one thing that I might realize is a strength that I didn't understand before as being a strength, which is I have permission to be more assertive or to be maybe raising expectations. If I did one thing differently, whether it's through a habit or a set of habits, that's a great place to start. Think about your interpersonal relationships in your life. If you got better at one thing with one of your children, with a loved one, what kind of difference would that make? Again, think about your goals. This is January. It's a great time to set some goals for the year. So if you think about your goals, what one thing would most perhaps help you with a particular constituent? And what does your organization need from you? What do you need from your organization? And that might help you prioritize. So when it comes to closing perception gaps, having trusted advisors, having people who can give you real-time feedback and keep you honest is very important. It's important to follow up over time and to show people that you're acting on it. Engaging with feedback is super important. There's an old saying in leadership, I think it's an older article, that leadership is a contact sport. And you're not operating in a vacuum. One of our colleagues, our good friend Carl Robinson, always likes to say, leaders cast long shadows. And you can bet that's true. And in a sense, the more you take on, the more responsibility. You're on stage and people are kind of watching you. So we've developed a practice with the folks we work with based on research that there's just a number of things you can do to help close perception gaps. And one of them is to, when you get feedback, especially let's say you're getting a 360 feedback, sometimes people just say thank you, they take the report, they put it in the desk and they think about it. But what is the best way to engage with the people who gave you that feedback? So it's really helpful to think about, all right, here are the two strengths that were most reinforced in getting 360. Here are the 2 or 3 areas that I really need to work on. I'm going to go to some of the people that gave feedback. I'm not going to tell them that I know where the feedback came from, but I'm going to say, hey, I heard that these 2 things I do are really helpful. I hear that I can do these 2 or 3 things better. Keep me honest. Hold me to my desire to do better. Please come to me and let me know what you see. And I'm going to keep following up with you. And the research will show that this sort of process creates perceptions of improved behaviors, leads to improved behaviors. So it's sort of a no-brainer winner in terms of how do you help close some perception gaps. When people understand in an authentic way that you're working on things and you keep coming back and asking for more input, it tends to make a difference over time. So saying that perception gaps, I think, are really very prominent in executive coaching, whether it's getting the most out of a strength or thinking about something you might want to take off of the radar screen. So thinking about a few case studies. Number five is um, I'm thinking of people that I've actually coached and uh, thinking about an executive who's been very successful, but upon receiving 360 feedback, um, they were told that they should be, we really want to see this person pushing their comfort zones. And in our coaching dialogue, a lot of the times when I might gently nudge this person on, have you shown that you're pushing your comfort zones? The answers or the discussion really kind of tended to go more towards, yeah, we're not really in a spot where there's an opportunity to step into things the way I would like to because it's the summer and we're not as busy and we're not together as often, or we have some things coming up. There's going to be some transitions that now is not the time. And uh, by about the third or fourth time we talked about this, I think the executive I kind of came to the conclusion. I guess you're going to keep bringing this up, right? What do I need to be doing to show that I'm pushing my comfort zones on setting strategy, on taking chances with talent, and sharing talent across the organization? And it really was just this sort of instance of, oh, the most important thing is for people to be seeing me pushing my comfort zones. And this executive began to do that a bit more, and it really helped them. Another case study that comes to mind is a CEO who is very, very good at taking companies, scaling them, and getting them ready to go public or getting them ready to be sold. They get results. They have management teams that do way more than they ever thought was possible. And sometimes this CEO can be pretty direct in ways that can be jarring. And I think this individual feels like this really works for them. But some of our dialogue really turned to, um, is it helpful to you in the long run in terms of your legacy and how you want to be remembered and building followership to maybe act a bit more presidential? It's okay to be direct. It's okay to show that more is always possible. But when um, you do someone out in front of a room full of 100 people, what is the impact? Does that actually work against you? And I would say that we had kind of some success when thinking about legacy and building followership to sort of curbing this a bit because it unnecessarily worked against this person's reputation. Um, Another case that comes to mind is a very effective, very successful CFO who had a high bar for accountability. And there was no one in this organization, big organization, who would think that they don't get results and that the team isn't better because of the pressure they put on the team. One of the perception gaps that we kind of stumbled into was just through dialogue of, talk about this 360 you got, when you can be too direct, what is that like? And just sort of playing this back, this CFO said, well, I told this person what I need you to do. And it was a really interesting moment where we kind of said, okay, hold on, let's think about that. When you are so direct, what is the impact on your peers receiving you're saying, I need you to? Is there a better way to do that? And they found that by just thinking about that simple way of speaking, that simple behavior, they're able to be assertive, demanding, but to be much more engaging and to have less things that got in the way. As the CEO said to this person during one of our meetings together, if people are a little bit afraid of you, how are they going to be at their best? And this person probably has the potential to be a CEO someday. So really just thinking about the way I speak to people is conveying something that I may not be aware of. And you can kind of see how these perception gaps really get at what's at stake for people. Two more case studies. Thinking of a CEO who's been in role for a while now, but they're really still kind of in the stage of establishing themselves as the number one. They held important roles in the past, but now they're the number one. And what does it mean to be a number one versus a number two? They're off to a very good start. One of the things they would do in team meetings, though, is the in between spaces in the agenda, they would spend on their phone or they would not engage with others. This person is a little bit shy. What they found, though, is that this introvert behavior, not that there's anything wrong with being introverted, but disengaging a bit in the moment, not being present, led to some mixed messaging. Do you want to be here with us? Is this as important as to whatever you're looking at on your phone? Which really kind of horrified this person that, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm sending mixed signals because nothing is more important to me than being in the here and now. And so we've worked on this and it's really helped. The last one that comes to mind is working with someone who is really focused on promotion and has a bit of a reputation for asking for promotion frequently. Hey, what's next for me? And what we've been working on is helping them think about sending a message of, hey, I'm here to help us focus on being successful over years in this role and raising the bar on what's possible. And initially, this person had a hard time kind of wanting to talk about negative feedback and what they're doing to address it. And they've become more open to it because, of course, everybody has things that they need to get better at. And the perception gap of being known, and you become a little infamous for, hey, I'm ready for what's next versus, yeah, but what are you focusing on? You've moved around a lot because you're very talented. Are we going to get sustained improvement over a set of 2 or 3 years? So perception gap is really important to all of these cases. There's a lot at stake, whether it's building followership, legacy, advancement, establishing themselves. And certainly in some cases, it can turn into, am I going to be successful in this job over the long term? I tried to give some insight into what is the coaching process like. And I have a quote from the CFO in this list. And they said, this has been really helpful coaching because we explored things and I've learned a lot. While I have confidence in my instincts, I'm getting better at being my best self. I reflect on what's detracting from who I want to be and what I want to accomplish. And doing it just feels better. When I don't overreact or try to overcorrect and fix things, I give things time to breathe rather than acting out of fear. And if that doesn't speak to someone being motivated by understanding their perception gaps and doing something about them, so those are a few examples. And that's my piece. Any questions?
We do actually have several questions, and then I think a couple of these could be also towards Maria if she wanted to answer. But Keith, do you feel like anonymous surveys for staff are more effective to get honest feedback?
Well, I guess I would wonder, Melissa, is that like an engagement survey or is that a 360? But anonymity is really important. I think that's the short answer. And I bet Maria, you would have a good bit to say about that.
Yeah, absolutely. You want people to feel comfortable, right, providing their honest feedback. So, yeah, so absolute agreement there.
The next question is for either of you, what tends to be the most important leadership traits or gaps that lead to success or failure?
Mm, great question. Um, when I think of um, the traits that are most relevant to success, I think it's um, curiosity and wanting to understand how oneself can improve as a leader and get better. And I think developing an understanding of um, having a vision that's really important to others and is aspirational. And I think a couple of gaps that can get in the way of success is that, every time someone takes on a new responsibility, it can feel a little bit like drinking out of a fire hose. Sometimes people withdraw in those moments. They may not rely on the people around them who might have some very long tenures and be really terrific to help address the problem together. And I think, probably lack of humility, um, arrogance, and really not really. Maybe the last thing I would say, well, I don't know that it's a gap that, a trait, but probably what really gets in the way for success for a lot of leaders is, how am I spending my time, and how should I be spending my time? Because often that changes when you're taking on something new. And talk about a perception gap. Thinking your time, how you actually spend your time is a classic perception gap.
That's really actually that kind of I love that answer. That well, the whole answer, but that last part, right, about how you're spending your time, because it leads to what I was thinking about this one. So we do a lot of research on best practices, right? So what are the behaviors? So not traits necessarily, but behaviors and, what you're doing with your time as a leader that lead to leadership effectiveness, in different industries, at different levels, in different regions of the world, different contexts, right? And also for different outcomes, right? So, you know, uh, uh, employee engagement, overall effectiveness. I mean, there are a lot of different, potential. There are a lot of different things we can measure. But one thing that we found over and over again, and it doesn't come out in every study, but it's kind of the trend that we see in most of these, is that there are three leadership behaviors that tend to correlate with effective leadership in many well, most of these cases, not all, but most, it's communication. So clarity of communication, making sure that you're keeping people informed as things change, communicating completely, so that people know what you're asking of them, what you know, what they need to know. So that's one communication, management focus. So behaving like a leader, taking charge, being in control, right? Like raising your hand if you don't have the leadership authority yet, but being willing to stand up and take charge of the group. So that's one. And then the final one is being strategic, thinking broadly, being future focused. So those three behaviors, we call them the key three, tend to show up over and over again. So if I'm coaching someone who has a perception gap around one of those, where they are scoring themselves higher than their observers are seeing them, then that's definitely something we want to explore further, and see if there, if it's worth working on. There's specific ones according, depending on context, right? So delegation and direct reports, right? That's important. That's a big gap if they're experiencing less of that than you think you're putting out there. But those key three, communication, being the leader, and then strategic, seem to be important.
Melissa, I'd say I'd share one more set of observations. We've spent the last 2, 3 months interviewing CEOs,
Mm-hmm.
and it's the last 5 years have been extraordinary. And all of the folks that we've been speaking to talk about how the you know speed, the ambiguity, the complexity of what needs to be dealt with now is unprecedented in their careers. So we've been asking questions and follow up to that observation. And certainly what we hear time and again is the importance to practice resilience, have more practices for resilience, encourage people you lead to take care of themselves and to stay balanced, a focus on constant adaptation, and in that constant adaptation to find competitive opportunities. Because if you're thinking the supply chain problems are going to morph and change every 3 months, and we're never going to get on the other side of fixing this problem. It can really take a toll on motivation and engagement, even at the most senior levels. But what are the opportunities that this turmoil creates for us? And then also just understanding the need to make decisions quickly. Sometimes people say fail fast, but many leaders reflected on it. If I had to have perfect data like 5 years ago, like 10 years ago, I would never be able to help this organization keep pace with the market, what's going on out there. So being able to make decisions quickly, take action, because, for example, if you're in technology, innovation is going to quickly make you irrelevant in 9 months if you're not constantly adapting. So that really kind of came to mind because these are sort of unprecedented times in terms of the difficulty and complexity of leading others to achieve what you're trying to do.
Thanks, Keith and Maria. If there's no more questions, I just want to thank everyone for joining. You will receive a recording of the webinar and the slide deck. And stay tuned for our next webinar on how better team dynamics can improve organizational effectiveness. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thanks.
you.